In early 1942, as the Americans joined the Second World War, Axis powers were in the ascent, having swept back the Allies across the European and Pacific theaters. The United States now mobilized for war, its first objective to halt the onslaught of the Imperial Japanese forces. Many would contribute to this effort, but among the first into the fight would be a new purpose-built unit meant to act as the tip of the spear. An elite within an elite, inspired by the British commandos and the Chinese communist guerrillas. They were born as America's first special operations troops, from whose lineage would come the US Special Forces of today. Armed with a unique kit, innovative organization, and experimental tactics, their baptism by fire would come in the dawn of the Pacific War. Here, they fought in virtually every island-hopping event and made the first landing on Japan. From the Makin Island raid to the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Long Patrol, and more, this unit's soldiers and commandos would distinguish themselves with 7 Medals of Honor, 141 Navy Crosses, 330 Silver Stars, and countless other accolades. Truly, they were a force to be reckoned with, and certainly to be remembered. So today, let us look at the unique history of the Marine Raiders of World War II.
I love learning about these units and battles of history, but I have to admit they always leave me with an itch for taking up the command chair myself. But you can do so today through our sponsor, War Thunder. It's one of the most comprehensive vehicle combat games ever made, with over 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from World War II and the Cold War. These face off in dynamic, combined arms PvP battles, which you can play on PC, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and Series S, as well as previous console generations. The atmosphere is super immersive, with incredible graphical details, authentic sound effects, and beautiful music, which sets the atmosphere just right. As a fan of military history, I love how you can choose from vehicles from over 100 years to really get a sense of their evolution in terms of appearance and capabilities. What's more, you can customize all of this in a 3D decorator using hundreds of markings, equipment sets, and camouflage patterns. The gameplay itself is riveting, with features such as X-ray damage that provides feedback on your hits, or the mouse aim mode for controlling aircraft without the need for dedicated joystick inputs. For me, these dogfights are the best part of the game, as I grew up playing flight simulators at the museum, but always missed the competitive side of things that this game offers, which has yielded some of my favorite high adrenaline moments. So play War Thunder today for free on PC, Xbox Series X and S, and PlayStation 5, as well as previous console generations, by using my link to download the game and get your exclusive bonus of multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and more. See you on the battlefield.
The US Marine Raiders would formally come into existence in February of 1942, under orders from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who sought to create an American counterpart to the British commandos. This new force was to conduct special operations against the Japanese in order to win sorely needed victories at a time when Axis powers were sweeping back the Allies across both the European and Pacific theaters. However, its inception was not the result of any singular actor, but rather the convergence of several parallel efforts, which we shall now cover. One of these stories involves the general trajectory of the US Marine Corps following the First World War. Here, post-war exhaustion, coupled with austerity of the Great Depression, sapped the will of the United States population and leadership to continue to invest heavily in military matters. Thus, successive cuts would trim down the number of Marines to just 16,000 men by 1933. Yet these would not sit idle. Over the course of the 20s and 30s, they would remain apprised of the conflicts still burning across the world. and take part in a number of small-scale interventions across Central America and beyond. Here, they put into practice lessons learned from the First World War and began to prepare themselves for the next major conflict. Thanks to several pivotal leaders, the Marine Corps now became focused on building a strong foundation in amphibious operations for a foreseen war in the Pacific. Key to these efforts would be General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, who would come to be known as the father of modern US amphibious warfare. While the Marine Corps schools had created the first manual on such operations in 1935, it was his task to convert these classroom theories into reality. This would be done over the course of many war games and training exercises. A prime example would be during the fleet landing exercises of the early 1940s, where he observed how a lack of adequate landing craft made it impossible to rapidly build up combat power on hostile beaches, leaving initial assault elements pinned down and vulnerable to counterattack. Over the course of several exercises, he demonstrated how just a small force, deployed secretly the night before a landing, could effectively distract and disrupt enemy defenders, resulting in far more efficient operations. The doctrine he helped pioneer would call for future assaults to be carried out in 3 waves. The first wave would consist of light, fast-moving forces to seize key terrain meant to inhibit the enemy's combat effectiveness. The second wave would consist of the main combat forces to finish securing the softened beachhead. And finally, the third wave, consisting of the reserve and support forces, would arrive to propel the entire group beyond the shore towards its next objective. With these plans in mind, and General Smith now in command of the entire Amphibious Force Atlantic Fleet, the military bureaucracy began turning to bring to bear assets which would fill the purpose of these first-wave spearhead assaults. This initially meant selecting existing Marine units and redesignating them for a new role, while hand-selecting officers that would be able to guide their evolution. While many were involved in this initiative, we will focus on the efforts of 2 men who would come to lead the 1st and 2nd Raider Battalions, namely Lieutenant Colonels Merritt "Red Mike" Edson and Evans F. Carlson. Merritt Edson, nicknamed Red Mike for his vibrant beard in the field, first joined the Marines in 1917 at the age of 20 and sailed to fight in France during World War I. While his unit did not see combat, he nonetheless gained valuable experience and would go on to launch a distinguished career of diverse service. This included leading Marine detachments across 12 engagements in Central America, helping to establish the fledgling Marine Corps Institute, accruing extensive training in aviation, captaining and winning national trophies for both the Marine Corps rifle and pistol teams, as well as receiving many more accolades. By 1937, at the age of 30, he had been promoted to major and was stationed in China as the Japanese Empire began its expansion. Thus, he was selected as an ideal candidate to lead and whip into shape the 1st Battalion 5th Marines for its anticipated role as one of General Smith's first wave units for amphibious operations in the Pacific. Under his exacting eye, they would become the epitome of the perfect Marines. Evans Carlson, by contrast, was a leader of entirely different make, whose personality would birth a very distinct 2nd Battalion. The son of a Congressionalist minister, he had run away from home at 14, lied about his age to join the army at 16, and ultimately served in the First World War, where he was awarded the equivalent of a Purple Heart for action in France. For several years, he continued to work his way up through the army, but at the age of 26, jumped tracks to the Marines. In this capacity, he would serve on several tours across the world, from China to Nicaragua, receiving many commendations for his duties and earning a Navy Cross in the process. While stateside, he rounded out his professional development by studying law and politics at George Washington University in D.C. Serving as XO of the Marine Corps unit stationed at the President's Vacation Retreat, he also made some powerful connections by befriending both Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his son James. In 1937, Carlson would travel to China as an observer of the erupting Sino-Japanese War. But rather than learn from a distance, he embedded himself with the Chinese forces, whose language he had learned. Here, he lived as they did and traveled thousands of miles with them into the interior of the country. In doing so, Carlson gained valuable insight on not only Japanese operations, but also the highly effective tactics of the Chinese guerrillas. Armed with this knowledge, he would return to the United States with a new zeal to both warn of the looming Japanese threat and advocate for the style of fighting he believed could defeat them. Using his connections, Carlson seems to have influenced the president's son James to submit a paper to the head of the Marine Corps entitled The Development Within the Marine Corps of a Unit for Purposes Similar to the British Commandos and the Chinese Guerrillas. However, the establishment did not take well to the idea of redirecting resources towards the creation of such experimental pet projects. Commandant Thomas Holcomb stated, quote, "The term Marine is sufficient to indicate a man ready for duty at any time, and the injection of a special name, such as Commando, would be undesirable and superfluous." However, the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. With then-Captain Roosevelt's involvement and Admiral Nimitz's request for a raiding force to take lightly defended Japanese islands, the conditions were right to generate enough pressure to force the Marine Corps' hands. Thus, on February 16, 1942, Edson's 1st Special Battalion was redesignated the 1st Raider Battalion, and 3 days later, the 2nd Raider Battalion was created under the command of Evans Carlson. 1st Battalion would inherit the strict, by-the-book training of its traditional-minded Lieutenant Colonel. By contrast, 2nd Battalion would be molded by the more radical leadership of Carlson, who espoused a more egalitarian and philosophically minded style, which drew influence from his time with the communist guerrillas. This was best embodied by the adopted mantra, gung-ho, which roughly translates to work together. For instance, Carlson would actively break down the caste system that existed between officers and enlisted personnel, limiting the use of rank badges or salutes and hosting gung-ho sessions that were effectively town halls, where all the men were free to criticize one another, discuss topics, and generally build bonds of camaraderie. On a more individual level, he pushed a practice of ethical indoctrination, meant to ensure that each man not only knew how to fight, but why he was fighting. Let us now take a closer look at how one trained to become a Marine Raider. Generally speaking, all recruits had already passed through the official Marine Corps boot camp. Yet, while there was little shortage of men clamoring to join the fight against Japan, there was a real lack of experience among these green troops. Thus, the various officers of the Marine Corps found themselves in competition over the talent pool as they rapidly built up their divisions for the war effort. The Raider battalions were privileged in that they were given priority to cherry-pick their candidates. In doing so, they had a strong preference for men fit for the anticipated mission, such as outdoorsmen, hunters, swimmers, scout sniper graduates, and talented volunteer Navy corpsmen. These were to be the best of the best. Edson had the initial edge in manpower, given that he was already in command of an existing unit that became the 1st Raider Battalion. However, leadership saw fit to transfer 1/3 of these men from their East Coast base at Quantico to the 2nd Raider Battalion, which was to be formed in California at Camp Pendleton. This new group was commanded by Evans Carlson and was seconded by none other than the president's son, James Roosevelt. Yet, as we previously mentioned, the two had their own ideals for this new force when it came to not just capability, but also philosophy. For instance, interviews with candidates purportedly questioned everything from their willingness to stab a man in close quarters to their ability to philosophize on the virtues of a just war. With such exacting standards in place, apparently most of the men sent by Edson were rejected. Yet soon, the ranks of both battalions had been filled and training could commence. Generally speaking, both groups of soldiers would face an intense regimen meant to further refine their skills as Marines. This included a heavy emphasis on physical conditioning, primarily through long endurance hikes, and mental conditioning through exercises that resolved their nerve and prepared them to act decisively in high-stress conditions. Much time was also spent building up technical skills in weapons practice and demolitions. But perhaps most important in terms of field training would be preparations to act as the tip of the spear without the guarantee of artillery, vehicle, aircraft, or support assets. This meant learning to camouflage, stalk, ambush, envelop, and close in to close quarters. The latter of these involved hand-to-hand combat training with grappling and live bayonet sparring. However, as always, the influence of their commanders would have a noted impact. For instance, Edson aimed to build special forces with more conventional employment and thus focused on excellence at traditional landing operations and achieving a marching pace more than double that of regular troops. In these matters, he led by practical example. Carlson, on the other hand, aimed to build a true guerrilla force. He therefore focused more on night operations, infiltration, and self-reliance, with many lessons delivered by inspirational speeches in his distinct gung-ho style. With this context in mind, let us now take a look at how these soldiers went into battle. The equipment of the Marine Raiders was quite distinct both visually and functionally. This began with their issued battle dress, the M1942 frogskin pattern. They were actually the first unit issued with this variant, which featured a 5-color jungle pattern on one side and the 3-color beach pattern on the reversible inside. The material itself was a lighter kit than their peers, which was meant to last them several months in rough conditions. For protection, they wore no armor besides steel helmets with cloth covers so as to travel as lightly as possible. Survival gear, ammo, and rations were carried on their person in a pouch or backpack. In terms of offense, the Raiders were extremely well equipped, having pulled presidential favors to get their men everything they needed. Whereas regular Marine squads sported 8 Springfield bolt-action rifles and a single bar, the Raider squads carried multiple M1 semi-automatic rifles, M50 Risings, bars, and Thompson submachine guns. Occasionally, they even fielded the Boys anti-tank rifle as seen during the Makin raid. Yet, the Raiders were hesitant to get too bogged down with heavy weaponry. For instance, they replaced the traditional 81mm mortar with a 60mm variant, which was more mobile. Along the same lines, they relied on several knife variants for both close quarters combat and general utility. This included the so-called stiletto knife, styled after the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, and a massive 9-inch Bowie knife, known jokingly as the gung-ho knife. When it came time to deploy, the Marine Raiders were mostly carried in high-speed transport destroyers. These APDs were World War I-era destroyers converted into transports, whose torpedo tubes and 4-inch guns were replaced with a small number of 3-inch guns to make room for troops and 4 Higgins boats. Entering the battlefield might be achieved using larger landing craft, but more often than not, the raiders made landfall atop small rubber boats, each of which could hold a squad of 8 to 10 men. Let us now discuss the organization of this Marine Raider squad and see how it fit into the larger structure of the Marine Raider Battalion. Once more, there were differences between Edson's 1st and Carlson's 2nd Battalion. The former utilized an 8-man squad composed of a leader, 2 barmen, 4 riflemen, and a sniper. The latter broke from this organizational table by pioneering a new 10-man squad with quite profound implications. For our purposes, we will be looking specifically at Evan Carlson's 2nd Battalion as it was organized around May through September of 1942. As mentioned, the lowest organizational unit was a squad of 10 men led by an NCO, who was typically a corporal. Thanks to the heavy loadout of the raiders, they could be broken out into 3 fire teams, each of which boasted a bar, a Thompson submachine gun, and an M1 rifle. By contrast, regular Marine and Army squads primarily fielded riflemen who acted in support of 1 light machine gun. As such, they did not have the weaponry necessary to break out in this manner and could not bring to bear anywhere near this amount of firepower. The tactical implications of this shall be discussed shortly. Moving on, we will note how 3 of these squads would be rolled up into a platoon with its own headquarters composed of a platoon commander, a platoon sergeant, a radio operator, and 2 messengers. Altogether, they numbered around 35 soldiers, which was just enough to fit inside the Nautilus and Argonaut submarines for the Makin Atoll raid. At the next level up, 2 of these rifle platoons would be joined by a weapons platoon, composed of a mortar section, 2 machine gun sections, and their HQ to form a company. This unit would be led by its own HQ of 11 men that included the commanding officer, his support staff, and various specialists such as the company armourer and the demolition sergeant. Altogether, they numbered about 104 men, which would fit into a single APD. Initially, only 6 such ships were available to Carlson's force, and so his 2nd Battalion was thus composed of 6 companies in addition to his overall HQ. There would be 4 Marine Raider battalions created over the course of 1942. Each was organized slightly differently until their unification into a single Raider regiment on March 15th of 1943, at which point a common method of organization was enforced. This would be a mixture of the various battalion structures, but at its base utilized Carlson's 10-man squad and 3-man fire team we previously described. By 1944, this structure would generally be extended to the entire Marine Corps, with the main difference being the addition of a 4th man to each fire team to make it more resistant to casualties. Let us now remark on the tactics employed by these units of the Marine Raider battalions. Generally speaking, the men of the 1st Battalion acted more similarly to conventional Marine forces, with the noted benefit of their squads carrying slightly more high-output automatic weaponry, which gave them more offensive punch. Carlson's guerrilla-inspired battalion, meanwhile, functioned quite differently. Owing to their squad's even greater firepower, 3 fire teams setup, and initiative-based training, they were able to respond to first contact with the enemy immediately without awaiting significant coordination. In mere moments, they oriented on the enemy, gained fire superiority, and advanced. In doing so, 2nd Raiders assaulted like a fast break, whereby everyone crashed their lane to overwhelm the foe, as if it were rehearsed, no matter who was to their flank. Another distinct tactical feature to note was that rather than the Clausewitzian-style direct assault practiced by most of the rest of the Marine Corps at the time, second raiders particularly emphasized flanking and envelopment. A base of fire pinned the enemy, while the Marines, able to move, found the enemy flank and assaulted through it under cover of suppressive fire. Raiders would even double envelop larger enemy formations. With the right terrain and geometries of fire, they might even attack from 3 directions at once. In this way could they maximize the deadly disruption of their raids. Now let us put this all into context with a review of their service history. In December of 1941, Imperial Japanese forces launched a wave of surprise attacks across the Pacific, aiming to uproot Allied positions, seize valuable resources, and establish a sphere of protection around the home islands. Over the following months, their campaigns through Southeast Asia proved brutally successful. For a time, American carriers in the area delivered the only ray of hope, helping to opportunistically strike at invasion forces as they advanced and launching the largely symbolic Doolittle raid. These helped boost Allied morale. Yet they also served to focus the next phase of the Japanese war effort on the destruction of the American fleet, and in particular her carriers. It was into this fray that the raider battalions would be thrown, shipping out in transports in April of 1942, to help bolster the beleaguered Allied lines in the Pacific. Along the way, they would conduct additional training operations and in May found themselves partially dispersed across garrisons to defend against imminent Japanese assaults. Yet, while they hunkered down to hold the beaches, the bulk of the fighting would take place at sea in a series of colossal naval clashes. This included the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, where rival fleets traded heavy blows to the strategic advantage of the Allies, and the Battle of Midway in early June, where the Americans laid a counter-trap that saw them score a massive victory against the Japanese, which sunk 4 carriers at the cost of only 1 of their own. Thus was the tide of the Imperial assault checked. Now it would be time for the counter-offensive. It was this moment that the raiders had been trained for. The ensuing operations of the 1st and 2nd Battalions would be conducted separately, but were both in service of the Solomon Islands campaign, meant to peel back an important strategic layer of Japan's Pacific defenses. Carlson's 2nd Battalion would be aimed at Makin Island, where planners hoped they could serve as a distraction and gather intelligence on the wider Gilbert Islands area. To do so, a raiding force of 211 men from A and B companies, including a headquarters element with both Carlson himself and James Roosevelt, were loaded on August 8th aboard the mine-laying submarines Argonaut and Nautilus for a stealth insertion. The initial approach went off as planned, but once in the operations area, things began to unravel. Poor weather involving heavy rains and high seas, coupled with miscommunication and mechanical failures, resulted in a confused split landing in the pre-dawn hours. Nonetheless, the main raider force advanced inland before swinging southwest towards the Japanese garrison around 0700. Here they encountered heavy resistance from prepared sniper and machine gun positions while sustaining 2 banzai charges. It was in this firefight that the raiders proved their mettle and eventually broke through thanks, in part, to the rear action of the previously separated Marine squad, which had attacked the Japanese rear, taking out 8 soldiers, the garrison commander, and a machine gun. At 13:30, a Japanese quick response force of 12 planes was detected. 2 flying boats carrying enemy reinforcements now attempted to land in the lagoon. However, the raiders ripped up the craft with machine guns and Boy's anti-tank rifles. destroying one and setting another on fire. The remaining planes attempted to bomb and strafe the Americans, but scored no hits when the guerrilla-trained forces melted back into the shadows. Throughout this time, they were assisted by natives on the island who helped supply Carlson with information about the status of the Japanese garrison and its reinforcements. Based on these reports, he assessed that a strong force still remained and decided now was the time to carry out the planned withdrawal for the next day's operations. However, mechanical failures and unexpectedly strong surf meant that despite repeated attempts, fewer than half of the boats managed to escape. Exhausted, loaded with wounded, and virtually out of supplies, Carlson made the call to send a message of surrender to the Japanese garrison. Yet, by luck, it appears not to have been received. The next morning brought a change of fortune. The enemy's strength was weaker than anticipated, and now the raiders were able to re-emerge. For the remainder of the day, they patrolled the island, gathering intel, destroying facilities, and picking off several more defenders. At 23:30 on 18th of August, having achieved radio contact with the submarines, Carlson and 73 of the remaining Marines were able to sail 4 miles to the entrance of the lagoon on a jury-rigged raft made of rubber boats, local boats, and the remaining 2 working outboard motors, and be picked up by the submarines. Post-action reports indicated that they had killed 160 of the enemy at the cost of 18 dead and 12 missing. While 2 medals of honor would be awarded as a result, it was not the most auspicious start for the raiders, but the event at least proved enough of a success that it could be hailed as a heroic, morale-boosting propaganda victory back at home. On a strategic level, however, it seems to have failed at diverting Japanese attention from the simultaneous Solomon campaign as intended. Meanwhile, Edson's 1st Battalion was taking part in this very offensive. The Allied invasion force managed to approach undetected on the night of August 6th, splitting up into 2 forces to attack Guadalcanal and the neighboring island chain. It was in the latter of these operations that the Marine Raiders, alongside 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, were tasked with taking the enemy position at Tulagi. Here, they successfully made a surprise landing unopposed, sweeping across the island before encountering heavy resistance along the enemy's entrenched positions in the southeast at dusk. That night, Edson's forces sustained 5 counterattacks along the line, composed of both frontal charges and small group infiltrations. The pressure proved so great that the Marines found themselves broken in several places, with fighting even resulting in hand-to-hand combat. One Marine reportedly killed 13 assailants before being dragged down, while others barely hung on for dear life. However, the elite force stood firm and the line held. At daybreak, American reinforcements arrived, allowing the Marines to complete their operation. All told, they had killed 307 Japanese at the cost of 45 men. It was an exemplary first mission, which earned Edson a gold star for his command. Meanwhile, the rest of the battle groups achieved their local objectives and substantial Allied forces were landed on Guadalcanal with minimal opposition. Here, the roughly 11,000 men of the 1st Marine Division took control of the airfield at Lunga Point and began to establish a surrounding perimeter. Yet the campaign's momentum would slow as nearby Japanese air and sea forces struck back. Facing mounting losses and fuel shortages, Admiral Fletcher's carrier force pulled back, followed shortly by Admiral Turner's group. The partially deployed ground troops were now on their own, with but a few supplies and the recently secured airfields. Sensing an opportunity, Japanese forces began to pool resources and position themselves for a major counterattack in early September, meant to utterly rout and annihilate the enemy's foothold on the island. At the time, Edson and his 1st Raider Battalion were brought in to reinforce the line at Guadalcanal and conduct offensive missions to disrupt the enemy's plan. Their ensuing raid on Tasimboco once again highlighted the effectiveness of his force as it seized significant supplies and intel. In the aftermath, his men were stationed on Lunga Ridge to recover in a perceived quiet area of the front. Unfortunately, this would prove to be a major target of the incoming Japanese assault, which had already begun its advance. On the night of September 12th, Japanese ships began shelling the Lunga perimeter, followed shortly thereafter by an assault of roughly 3,000 infantrymen. These soon began breaking through the thin marine lines. However, the thick jungle prevented them from fully overrunning the position and allowed Edson to reform his lines along the more defensible ridgeline. Sporadic fighting took place the next day, but all knew that the deciding moment would come when night once more fell. With just a few hours to spare, the raiders dug in and finalized their defensive preparations. As the sun set, Edson gave a rousing speech to his exhausted men, exhorting them to give just one more night. Thus rallied, his 830 men prepared to meet an onslaught of 3,000. The two would dance under a moonless battlefield. Soon, artillery shells began to rain down on the position, while flares provided scattered flashes of illumination. What followed was a brutal assault, which one observer described as follows. Quote, "The Japanese attack was almost constant, like a rain that subsides for a moment and then pours the harder. When one wave was mowed down, and I mean mowed down, another followed it into death. For hours, the Marines withstood hell as the Japanese came at them from all sides, forcing the defenders into a tight horseshoe perimeter around Hill 123. On several occasions, the Marine units faltered, teetering on the edge of a complete rout. However, they were held together by the bravery of their leaders. In these matters, none proved more pivotal than their commanding officer. One Marine captain stated, quote, "I can say that if there is such a thing as one man holding a battalion together, Edson did it that night. He just stood behind the front lines, stood when most of us hugged the ground." For this act of unique heroism, he would be awarded a Medal of Honor, while the Battle of Bloody Ridge would be hailed by the troops as the Battle of Edson's Ridge. As the sun rose the next day, the Japanese assault would finally relent and be pushed back by artillery and air support. All told, some 80 Marines lay dead, having traded their lives dearly for 800 of the attackers. It was a victory of triumphant proportions, which helped deal the Imperial Japanese Army its greatest defeat so far, and ultimately helped contribute to victory in the overall Guadalcanal campaign. However, this was no easy war, and affairs on the island dragged on for many more months. In October, the Japanese army, now reinforced to a strength of 20,000, attacked the American positions again, but were thrown back once more at the Battle of Henderson Field. Thereafter, Allied commanders wished to bolster their defenses by taking the offense. By now, Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion had joined the fight as well, and in early November was tasked with helping Army forces establish a new air base at the coastal village of Iola. Yet, once this initial mission had been achieved, they now followed secret orders to push deep into the jungle. Here, Carlson and his troops would fully leverage their unique guerrilla training to redeem themselves from the near disaster of Makin Island with a famous operation that became known as the Long Patrol. Stay tuned as we continue to relive the vaunted history of the Marine Raiders of World War II.
Remember to take part in your own massive battles with War Thunder. Play for free on PC, Xbox Series X and S, and PS5, as well as previous console generations by using my link to download the game and get your exclusive bonus of multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and more. See you on the battlefield.
You can catch script previews, participate in polls, and download our art by joining our Patreon. A huge thanks to our current patrons for supporting the channel and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe and check out these related videos. See you in the next one.